A watershed in, say, Hawaii may look different from that in Wisconsin or Vermont. The basic principles of how landscapes work remain the same. And finally, it invites people into the process of restoring ecologies because we see that this can happen everywhere and at all scales. In short, while we've been trained to believe that solving societal problems is best left to experts, earth repair is a participatory sport. And no one is better poised to lead this than those already engaged with their landscape and in conservation. One story that launched me on this path, meaning that I thought that everyone should know about it, is the restoration of the Loess Plateau in China. This is where agriculture in China began around the same time as it did in the Fertile Crescent and was long the breadbasket of China. However, hundreds of years of poor management led to massive erosion, with the mineral-rich but friable soil blowing away and silting up the Yellow River. This is a pattern in agriculture we've seen around the world, one that has been documented by authors from Plato, yes, Plato, to George Perkins Marsh, a fellow Vermonter, to J. Russell Smith, author of Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. The pattern is losing fertility, clearing forests to start moving to farm elsewhere, farming on hillsides, and letting livestock roam at will. In the early 1990s, weary of dealing with continuous flooding and poverty in the region, the Chinese government embarked on a major watershed rehabilitation project with help from the World Bank and other entities. I mean, this was major. They were consulting with hydrologists, geologists, biologists, chemists, economists, always a lot of economists. I mentioned that restoration is a participatory sport. Here in the Loess Plateau, local people from thousands of villages were hired to do the work of moving soil, creating terraces, planting trees and shrubs and crops. Admittedly, this was a top-down effort, unlike what would likely fly over here, but ultimately the region's people reaped the benefit as some 2 million were lifted from poverty. People who had been literally living in caves now had proper homes, and many dependent on food aid were able not only to grow what they need, but to have extra to sell, to actually have an income, which was a new thing for many of these people. Here is an 8-second version of what transpired over 14 years. Okay, Michael, so over to you. We may want to see this twice because it moves so quickly. Michael, do you have that video?
All right, it should have been showing. I apologize for whatever
That's okay.
technical problem I'm having here.
Oh, please.
Let me get back over. Let me go into it this way. There always has to be a technical problem, right?
Of course.
I'm going to stop my share for just a second and do this over again.
I know it's silly. Oh, there we go.
Do it one more time for good measure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So that was time lapse from 1995 to 2009, and I just love that. And can you guess? I mean, I'm asking you, but what the cost of that was? It was $17 per acre per year. That transformation. I mean, when you think about how much all of our governments, all of our localities pay to deal with the damage in our watersheds that we have to deal with. So it's unbelievable. We know a great deal about this transformation in the Los Plateau thanks to John D. Liu, a Chinese American filmmaker. Okay, so we can show a picture of John, who documented the project for the World Bank. Sorry, I just have to smile at this photo because John always wears like a safari jacket and a hat. So that picture is very John. So he's a Chinese American filmmaker who documented the project for the World Bank and whose time lapse we just saw. I highly recommend his films, Green, Gold, and Lessons of the Los Plateau. He does a wonderful job. And what he witnessed in that transformation changed his life. His feeling was, once you know that it's possible to restore large-scale damaged ecosystems, how can it not be your mission to do everything you can to make that happen? I certainly get that sentiment. So John delved into research on ecological restoration and found that, surprise, in the sciences, there was a ton about what happens when things go wrong, but very little about when things go right, when things improve on ecological function. Yet, as John says, and I can confirm, it's a heck of a lot more fun to focus on function rather than dysfunction. And yet, a focus on function opens up new ways to understand our environment, as well as how to restore the Earth's wounded places. Let's take, for example, the question, what is a desert? Now, we all think that we know what a desert is, that maybe there's a threshold of how much rainfall you get, that determines whether a place is a desert or not a desert. But I want to highlight what Neil Spackman says about a desert. He says that a desert is a place where it floods when it rains. And for all its aridity, it does flood in Western Saudi Arabia, and these episodes can be damaging. So Neil is saying that once it no longer floods when it rains, when the water soaks in and supports life, rather than running off and causing more erosion, this land will cease to be a desert. And what we're seeing is that at Al Beta, this is starting to be the case. So next photo, this is also from 2019. Now, you can see where they have the earthworks, where they were slowing down the water. Now, if you just saw this picture and I hadn't been talking about the desert, I wonder, would people guess this was a desert? But we can see it is starting to become something else ecologically, which I think is extraordinary. The process of ecosystems advancing in function and complexity, what we saw in that last second or two of John's film clip, is called succession. Simpler pioneer organisms create the conditions for higher order species to thrive, and so the whole system functions at a higher state. You don't just start in a desert planting big canopy trees or in a degraded landscape. Rather, you build toward them with plants that either give way or become part of the system. The heart of ecological restoration is to advance succession. In other words, to become nature's ally on the ground and help a living community move in a positive direction. In that way, it's more midwifery than makeover. According to John Liu, the way to advance succession and by extension to restore an ecosystem involves three basic trends. Next slide. You can jot this down, for it is the recipe. Increasing biodiversity, increasing soil organic matter, and increasing biomass. This is something that we can apply anywhere, in a local park, on a farm, in someone's front or backyard, by a lakeside. No effort is too small. After filming the Los Plateau project, John struggled to find a way to scale up ecological restoration to ensure that the skills and knowledge needed to harvest water, to build terraces, manage livestock, choose combination of plants is widely available. At one point, he came up with the idea of camping, of locations throughout the world where people, once invited, would set up tents or yurts, take their shovels and machetes, and set out to heal the land. 2 years ago, I went to the first camp, Camp Altiplano in Spain. Next slide. This is where they broke the idea in, learning as they went. So here is the kitchen area of Camp Altiplano. And they were so proud. Now, when I say that they were breaking in the concept, well, they learned some hard lessons. And one of the lessons that they learned is that it makes sense to set up camps in places where they already have infrastructure. Because here at Camp Altiplano in Spain, they were starting from scratch. They were living in far from the site, like a 10-minute bike ride from the actual site that they were seeking to restore, in like 1500 era stone buildings, and setting up things like the kitchen tent. So they learned. So now they have places that already have some kind of infrastructure. It's hard to convey the spirit here of young people learning and applying their skills, taking part in healing a landscape, cheering every bit of progress. The thing that struck me was how the people here, mostly British and Europeans in their late 20s and early 30s, felt a part of the solution to the problems that haunted them, that worried them. So back in 2018, when I went, there were just 2 camps. Now there are 37, with more in progress all the time. So this is becoming a global movement, as John envisioned. And it's funny, I remember being, this is such a crazy memory, at the Paris climate talks in 2015. John was there, and we had gathered a group of people in a Chinese restaurant, the back room of a Chinese restaurant. And John was ordering everything because he knew Chinese and none of us did. And he was sort of sitting back and grandstanding in his endearing manner, talking about camping, saying, let's go camping, let's go glamping. And I still remember his daughter was there. Oh my gosh, Dad. But you know, what sounded like a wild dream is coming to fruition. One camp, next slide, Camp Paradise, was launched in the aftermath of the Camp Fire in Butte County in California. And it was created as a disaster response camp, where the focus is on how to build resilience after fire and developing the tools and protocols to minimize risks to the watershed. You see, what happens with a disaster is that everyone's eyes are on the dramatic flames. Afterwards, the reporters move on and the community is left to deal with problems like mudslides and toxic ash flowing into waterways. The point is that although we don't always hear about it, there are people creating solutions. And this is just a shot from the website of the Campfire Restoration Project, which is in the ecosystem restoration camp community, and that people are doing it and learning. And every once in a while, I'll see a post of looking for people with particular expertise, that there's this network that is ready to mobilize whenever there's a disaster. And people are learning these skills, and it's really, really meaningful. So in terms of solutions, let's look at another type of solution for a different kind of landscape. Next slide. There's a practice called syntropic. Oh, okay. I forgot that I'd put that in there. So no, we can go back. So yeah, John, this is another quote from John Liu, that earth repair follows evolutionary trends. We can think of eco-restoration as applied succession. And that is a way to think about it, that by building biodiversity, building biomass, building soil organic matter, we are acting as nature did to create lush and healthy ecosystems, and kind of boosting, helping it move along and accelerate it. And one example of accelerated succession is this practice called syntropic agroforestry. So next slide. We can, here the focus is on creating the conditions for each plant to thrive, which in turn creates the conditions for the next order of organisms to thrive. The idea is to create the antithesis of entropy, to concentrate matter and energy. It at once emulates and accelerates natural processes. It was developed by Ernst Goetsch, a Swiss farmer who moved to Brazil 30 years ago and transformed 300 acres that had been deforested and overgrazed to a lush, densely vegetated area that produces 3 times the cocoa than is typical for the area. So this is being applied in many parts of the world. And here, that's me with a young fellow named Ben in Maui, in Hawaii 2 years ago. So this was a eucalyptus monoculture. So it looked green, but it wasn't functioning very well ecologically. When you have a monoculture, it's very prone to problems. You're not getting a lot of biodiversity, and eucalypts are not native to Hawaii, so it wasn't benefiting the local biodiversity. So they decided to create a syntropic agroforestry project. And they put in a variety of early successional plants like pineapple and bananas. I mean, like, to me, they're so exotic, but bananas apparently grow so easily and so fast that, they just start chopping down the biomass. That's how this particular approach works. You get plants that are growing very quickly, and then you do a lot of pruning. The pruning creates a lot of biomass that is covering the ground. So you get this thick layer of mulch, which builds more of the soil organic matter and creates the conditions for more complex, mature system plants to grow. They do a similar approach at another place on the island that I saw called Hokonui. Next slide, where the forester, his name is Koa Hewahewa, he calls it polyforestry or Polynesian agroforestry, and draws on indigenous Hawaiian knowledge. So, so Koa, actually, his name, Koa, is the name of a tree, like a tree that they really revere in Hawaii. It's a very tall canopy tree. And the hope is that they will build the conditions for those kinds of trees that have a lot of function in the ecosystem through this process. Now, what we see here This was 14 months of growth. So in Hawaii, things grow incredibly fast. And they are working here on this forestry project a quarter acre at a time. Beyond the basics of enhanced biodiversity, enhanced biomass, and enhanced soil organic matter, the restoration approach for a given place depends on context. On the Los Plateau, one important strategy was removing livestock, because what was happening is that people were letting their livestock wander. So there were pictures that John Liu had of like a hillside with maybe 3 blades of grass and a goat wandering and nibbling that grass. So the plants did not have a chance to recover. So they removed the animals from the area and did pen feeding. So they were able to keep their animals, and that enabled the plants to grow and then for them to plant higher order plants and on. However, as many of you know, in many instances, grazing animals are a tool for regenerating landscapes. One place where I witnessed this is Rancho Las Damas, next slide, in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. I went there. Oh, I love these bulls. I think they're so handsome. I went there because I learned of an interesting project. Ranchers were working with bird conservation organizations to create a corridor for habitat for endangered migratory grassland birds. I was intrigued by this because I did not think of bird conservationists and ranchers as natural allies, as such groups often clash. But the people at the bird organization saw that under holistic management, which creates the optimal extent and rhythm of animal impact, with cattle moving as they would in nature when pursued by predators, the land was vibrant and full of birds. One thing I like about this particular project is how it is expanding in the region. So when I went, there were 5 ranchers, and in Chihuahua, the land is vast. Ranchers are managing huge tracts of land. So there were 5 that were in this project, and it still represented a lot of land. So when I was visiting, my host was Alejandro Carrillo, and right next to his ranch was land that looked terrible, just degraded, just a little bit of mesquite here or there, but mostly bare soil. And I said to Alejandro, doesn't this make you crazy? Can't you just convince the owner to change? Now, unlike me, Alejandro has a lot of patience. He answered me with one of his favorite sayings, which is that most people would rather fail conventionally than succeed by doing something different. Don't worry, Alejandro said, he'll decide to change. 3 years later, the owner of that land came to Alejandro and said, I want my land to look like your land. And we're talking here about 100,000 acres or so. That can support a lot of birds and butterflies and mule deer and pronghorn sheep and all of the type of creatures that are beginning to come back to the land as these ranchers are restoring it. Now let's shift a bit to water, which after all is the theme of the week. We often think that water just happens to us, that too much or not enough water depends solely on what does or doesn't come down from the sky. However, we have tremendous agency, particularly once we understand that we can think of soil as our water infrastructure. So let's go now to Zimbabwe. Next slide. To the Africa Center for Holistic Oh, okay, sorry. That's at Rancho Las Damas. And the reason I have this slide is that it shows you just how things begin, okay? So you have this caked earth, nothing really happening. But as you have the the animals, the cattle there, they're pressing in the soil so that you get places where water can begin to pool. They're also pressing down seeds that then get a chance to germinate once there is moisture. So now you can see in this, like, little microcosm of a desertified landscape, perennial grasses beginning to grow. So thank you for bearing with me there. Now we'll go to Zimbabwe, where Alan Savory runs the Africa Center for Holistic Management in Victoria Falls. So Alan, who developed the holistic management framework, says that what is important is not how much rain you get, but how much effective rainfall you have. By effective rainfall, okay, next slide, he means water that soaks into the ground. You see, you can get a huge amount of rain, and if most of it evaporates or runs off, you're no better off. And you may have more problems like flooding, loss of topsoil, erosion gullies, and mudslides. As my colleague Precious Fury in Zimbabwe says, there are places where no matter how much rain you get, you end up back in drought mode. To slow water and ensure that as much as possible stays in the soil, Neil Spackman, as we recall, began with water harvesting. So he created a water infrastructure by earthworks that sufficed until the soil was rich enough to become its own water infrastructure. Here in Zimbabwe, the focus from the start was improving the soil. Okay, next slide. Soil organic matter, which is mostly carbon, acts as a water absorbing sponge. Another key factor is soil cover, which deters both runoff and evaporation, which is really important in very hot, dry climates. This, we see, is the difference between having effective and non-effective rainfall. So these pictures, I think, were only about 4 years apart. And what's interesting is at the Africa Center, many of their before and after demos, when you see great improvement, that improvement actually occurred under conditions where elsewhere in Zimbabwe, it was considered drought. In other words, minimal rainfall. But by using holistic planned grazing, they were able to ensure that the rainfall they did get was effective rainfall. Okay, next slide. Building soil is the project of managing livestock holistically, which, as I noted, recreates the behavior patterns of ungulates in the wild. Managed animal impact builds the soil in many ways. It stimulates grass growth, which means that the grasses are pulling more carbon and drawing it down where it's released at the roots, which enriches the soil. The hooves press down decaying plant matter to be broken down by microbial life, and animal waste adds moisture and fertility to the soil. So here in Zimbabwe, these cattle are going to work for that day. This was around 6:30 in the morning in Zimbabwe, and just looking at that photo, boy, I can almost like feel the dust in my eyes. I could feel the heat beginning. It turns out that we went to Zimbabwe like at the height of the hot and dry season, but still, it was an incredible experience to be there with Alan Savory and his wife. And I mean, it was actually one of those experiences where I just have to pinch myself and say, what dumb luck brought me here? Because being with Alan and having him just read the land, just observing how he was engaged with the landscape and how he could look at a tree and tell me what animal had been by and when. Anyway, it was really, really extraordinary. So next slide. Here is one result of the holistic plan grazing. The Dimbengombe River now flows a kilometer further into the catchment than it has in living memory, and it now flows throughout the year. Nor does this watershed flood the way nearby parkland does. So while we were there, there was a spot where part of the watershed, one side of the river was parkland run by the National Parks Commission, and one was the Africa Center land. And Alan pointed out how, like, the level at which the flotsam that was carried by the floods had reached. And on the parkland, it was about 3 meters high. And at Dimbengombe, it was only about 3 feet high. So he explained that had we been on the parkland during a flood, that floodwater would exceed the height of the vehicle we were in. So that really made that quite vivid. So, just more about the improvements that they're able to make. Next slide. This is what it means in human terms. While in Zimbabwe, I had the chance to meet people in villages working with the Africa Center. Animal impact on their crop fields meant more soil organic matter. As we said, that's a key element of restoring the ecosystem. And that meant better water infiltration. For the people in Sianyanga, Zimbabwe, way off a dirt road near the Wangi National Park, that meant being able to grow food for 7 months out of the year, instead of what it had been previously, only 2.5 months out of the year around the rainy season. And that meant the difference between being self-sufficient food-wise and being dependent on international food aid. And I just remember spending the day with these people. I remember the woman smiling, her name is Busi. I don't remember the other woman's name, but I just remember how proud they are and how happy that they have been able to restore their land so that they could feed themselves. They didn't have to bring their cattle 20, 30 kilometers to get water. And that was something that meant that if they took, say, 10 cattle, they might come back with 5. They could grow their own thatch to mend their roofs. Their children could go to school because they didn't have to worry that the children didn't have enough nutrition to be strong enough to walk back and forth to the schools, because it was at a distance for walking. And then another thing is that when the ground was bare, there were these biting ants that were such a menace, that these were ants that thrive on bare soil. And they told me about how when the ants were really bad, people either wore shoes, or if they didn't have shoes, which many people didn't, they wore plastic bags over their feet. And, because they had to protect themselves from these ants. So when I was walking around the land with these women, this group of women, at one point, it might have been Boosie, I think it was somebody else, who said, "Look, an ant," because they wanted to show me what these ants look like, and they hardly see them anymore. So I watched this innocent looking ant, and never guessing that they were, made their lives so miserable. And then I looked and I noticed that all of the women were wearing open-toed sandals, something that they never would have dared at the height of the ant problem. So, just talking about the holistic plan grazing, there's a tremendous misunderstanding that people have about the role of animals in the landscape. We all hear that cows are bad and the like. I like the way a colleague of mine, Chris Hengler, who manages a huge cattle station in Australia, frames it. He says that cattle are power tools, that they're incredibly beneficial when used right, but can be extremely damaging if used incorrectly. And in many instances, I've found that government policy can be based on misunderstandings, that this can have major consequences for native communities and on the landscape. Just an example, with Chris Hengler. So in Australia, he's using holistic planned grazing to restore the land. And one really important thing that he's managing for fire resilience and reduction of brush fires in Western Australia. So the cattle are really important because they are managing the vegetation and they are hydrating the landscape, and that's important. But also there are these wild donkeys in Western Australia, this is like the outback or the outback of the outback. His land is a place where there are no roads. You can only get there by flying. So these wild donkeys, he realized, are really important for fire management when you manage them, steer their movement, because they are nibbling on brush that if they didn't nibble on it, and that turns it into, they're processing this biomass biologically. Otherwise, that brush would be, still standing, and in the dry season, it dries out and becomes tinder for fire. So he has the Wild Donkey Project for fire management. In Western Australia, they deem wild donkeys pests and are they've been trying to eradicate them. Now, Chris's work, Chris has been able to get a kind of truce there, which is wonderful. But, the point is that if you look at things ecologically, what we consider pests aren't always pests and can be beneficial. And this brings us to our last story, which is in Norway. So next slide. In 2017, I went to Trondheim to present at a conference on indigenous knowledge. My topic was the global ecology of grazing. So of course I needed to study up on reindeer. As it happened, when I was there, reindeer were very much a topic of discussion and great contention because the government had mandated that Sami reindeer herders drastically cull their herds because the government claimed that there were too many reindeer and that was damaging the fragile tundra ecosystem. One young herder, and here he is in the slide, his name is Jovset Antisara, all of 23 years old at the time, refused. He said that whittling his herd to 75 reindeer would make it impossible for him to survive as a herder. And he noted that this was true of all his peers, all herders starting out who are already working on thin margins, and that impeding young herders would mean that the tradition so central to their culture would just disappear. He appealed the law and he kept winning. And so when I was there, everyone was really excited because he kept winning. So what was going to happen? Everyone was in suspense. Later that year, unfortunately, the government finally prevailed. But what I want to point out is that the government was incorrect. The government claimed that the reindeer were harming the tundra ecosystem, but actually, when you look at how the animals impact the landscape, they were helping to preserve and maintain the tundra ecosystem. So here's how that works. During the summer grazing season, the reindeer were actively browsing. So they were eating the leaves of trees and the shrubs. The reason that this is important is that the shrubs and the leaves are darker than the heathlands that are the summer grazing areas. And the darker surfaces meant that they had a lower albedo or reflectivity, that rather than reflecting light and heat like the heathland, they were absorbing heat. So that makes the landscape warmer. So by eating that vegetation, the reindeer were keeping the area cooler and maintaining the heath landscape. In terms of their winter season, the people group together and they move their reindeer in huge numbers across the snowy region. And the trampling of these vast numbers of reindeer presses down the snowpack. And I know that sounds bad because, we love fluffy, fresh snow. But by pressing down the snowpack, they were like making it so that the snow was no longer insulating the soil surface, so that the surface is more exposed to the cold and staying frozen. So it was keeping the permafrost frosty. And research on areas in the far north where animals are grazing versus areas where there are no animals grazing, the areas where animals are grazing are kept colder. I mean, it was a pretty significant difference. And this matters a lot because we know that the areas around the poles are warming faster than other regions. So keeping that landscape cold is really important, because we don't want that permafrost to melt and get all that metabolism of the microbial life, which releases methane. That's all that we hear about. So we can thank the reindeer and thank the reindeer herders for doing that. So yeah, so the ecology of animals is not always how it seems. So this is our global tour of ecosystem restoration. Thank you for joining me on it. And just to share again that there are lots of opportunities to preserve and restore the land we manage, the land we own and lease, the land belonging collectively to our communities. I want to end with one last slide to alert you to something that I'm very excited about. Oh, one more slide. Right, so yes, thank you. That we are about to embark on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So this is launching June 5th, World Environment Day, and there are lots of plans for just to really build momentum for awareness of opportunities to restore our ecosystems, a lot of learning between different kinds of landscapes, and sharing stories. So I'm getting involved with this. Actually, I'm working on a media project to support the UN Decade. And yeah, they've got a lot planned. So hope you can join in. There will be lots of opportunities for citizen engagement. So stay tuned, and thank you. And however much time we have, I am very happy to hear your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful tour around the world of so many neat projects that are going on. That was just fantastic. And for everyone out there, if you have not read Judith's books, all three of them are just fantastic. And much of what she talks about is in her most recent one, The Reindeer Chronicles, which is great. We do have some time for some questions and answers. So if you have them, feel free to type them into the Q&A section. One that has many people have been asking about. So in the United States, folks are beginning to see the merits of replacing non-native plants within their gardens. Um, have you seen this trend elsewhere globally with home gardeners or community gardeners? And if you have, what kind of outreach helped to drive this behavior change?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So around the world, I'd say that permaculture is really driving people's interest. Well, a lot of things are driving people's interest. There's a permaculture movement. There's a lot of urban planning and bringing more plants and kind of little kind of mini wild areas into cities. There's the rewilding movement, which is generating a lot of interest. Actually, my husband, who's from South Africa, told me a really interesting story about South Africa, that someone had land in some rural land in South Africa where they found some San, some native people, some San art, and the art depicted different animals. And so the person said, well, if I'm going to manage this land, how about if I bring in the animals that the San told me were on this land thousands of years ago? So they brought animals, and apparently like the landscape really really rebounded and became much more healthy. So anyway, that's rewilding. Um, One thing about this I want to say, yeah, I think people are becoming more conscious of this, but it is an uphill battle because, well, as we know, we've been told that lawns are just the ideal for our landscape to be. We should be surrounded by these kind of like green carpets. And so our habits and assumptions take a while to change. But one thing I do want to say about this is that here in the US, we just don't realize how fortunate we are. So, because we have so much nature around us and we have a lot of land and we have so much opportunity. Whereas, like in the UK, for example, I mean, the amount of biodiversity the has been that's been lost in the last several decades is just huge. So we are starting from a really better place, and we often don't see it. So I would encourage, the permaculture um, ethos always talks about starting from a place of abundance, and to really see that we are starting from a place of abundance and that we can build more abundance. I think is really helpful. I hope that answered or
Yeah, that
shared.
was great. Thank you. Another question, going back to the beginning of the talk, some people are wondering the project in Saudi Arabia, how did that help alleviate poverty among the Bedouin or others?
Yeah, so this was a really contained project, and other aspects of the project were improved housing, improved access to work. So while the project was going on, this was giving local people work opportunities. So just to clarify, the insanity of what was going on there is that because the land had become so degraded, the Bedouin could no longer really feed their animals. So they were feeding their animals by buying imported grain from Australia. So you think about that, okay? So, all this grain is being moved, across the ocean and all that. In order to afford the feed, the Bedouin were cutting down trees for charcoal and for heating to sell to restaurants in nearby Jeddah and Mecca. So what I saw a lot in my research is that there are many situations where people are kind of put in the unasked for position that in order to participate in the global economy and live lives that have meaning, you know, that they can sustain, they are forced to undermine the ecology upon which they depend. So, you know, I wish I could say that this transformed their lives. I would say, but I can't, because the project had run into problems. You know, they stopped the funding. So I don't know exactly what is going on now. I imagine that they are able to use the plants. I know that Neil made a point that all the plants that they put in were not only had an ecological function, but had an economic function as well, so that they're getting food from it and getting products to sell. But my understanding is that the most important value of this project really is showing what can be done in an extreme environment and bringing those lessons and learning from what they did, and helping people to set, all of us to set our sights really high. And Neil himself, after the project ran out of funding, he went and did a kind of fast track executive MBA at Stanford. And he has launched a new company called Regenerative Resources. And that is using regenerative practices in different types of landscapes to help impoverished people and restore their ecosystems. So what he's working on now, the piece that I'm most up to date on, is in Baja California, building mangrove systems, because mangroves are so important to protect against floods. I mean, they're ecosystems that are really important where they are. They kind of, as water comes in, they kind of disperse it and help, like, you know, they manage the land ocean interface, put it that way. They're very important for that. And they are doing shrimp farming and mangrove restoration together. So shrimp farming in many parts of the world is very ecologically destructive, but this is regeneratively. So he's become someone very out there talking about ways to bring regenerative practices into business and restoring ecosystems in the process.
Great.
Yeah.
Another question, this is similar to a question that I had. You and I had discussed about this a little bit earlier. In almost all of the examples that you have given, there's really not, government does not really appear very often. And one question that has been asked is there a role for a revival of the Civilian Conservation Corps concept in the United States? And you know, how could something like that's maybe kickstarted by government, or are there ways that, what's your feeling on the role of government and a conservation corps idea?
Well, clearly you need a government that is willing to embrace these possibilities. And it seems like we have that happening now. So the Biden administration has announced, I think they're calling it the Climate Civilian Corps. And I understand that in California, they're already beginning to implement this. So this is the ideal. One thing that has just been so striking to me is the disconnect. So right now we have a lot of people. I have a 25-year-old son who, like many of his peers, there's no work for them. He's a performer, a musician. So, so many different, and waiting tables to, bolster his income, and there's no performance, there's no table waiting. So, and he's not alone. Many of his peers have had to move back home. And, so we have a generation of people who are underemployed and not doing work that they had hoped to do. And yet there's so much work to be done. So making that connection, I do know a lot of people in different, like the staff people of different senators. Certainly my senator, Bernie Sanders, I frequently talk to people in his office about regenerative agriculture possibilities, and they're on it. So I think it is happening. The point is that how does the government learn what's possible? And through grassroots efforts. I think government responds to us. It's also, I think, useful to think that a lot of the people in our government, think about it. They're like in cities. They're, like in conference rooms. They don't know necessarily what's happening on the land, and don't understand really, I mean, what ordinary people are thinking about. So there's this buffering in our country because our government is so big and our problems are so big. But yes, absolutely, there is a place for government, and it would be wonderful to have more of this happening, to have these partnerships.
Well, thank you so much for this keynote, Judith. For those of you who are sticking around as part of the Red Cedar Conference, Judith will be doing one of the next breakouts in the next session, and you'll be talking about permaculture and about holistic management. So if you're part of the Red Cedar Conference, you might want to check that out. At this point, I believe we have about a 15-minute break for most groups, but I want to give a water week and a Red Cedar Watershed Conference. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, Judith Schwartz.
Thank you.
And we will see you at the next sessions. Enjoy your day, everybody.